Hi, I'm Lisa Larson, and welcome to Module 1 of When the Past Feels Like It's Still Happening. So, this is information, coping skills, and healing options for surviving post-traumatic stress. And this is just an informational video series with guided meditations and a workbook to help you understand trauma and cope with traumatic stress in a healthier way. If you want to learn how to deal with it and also how to come up with a treatment plan for yourself, that is what we'll be doing here. And if feelings come up that you want to process with a therapist, I'm happy to do that as long as you're in California and willing to work virtually on video. So you can reach me at that email address or at 661-233-6771. If you instead are in another state or you already have your own therapist, you can use this as a guide to help you explore some of these issues. And you may want to keep your journal handy or use the workbook to help you process what you've learned about yourself along the way. And I really want to urge you to go at your pace. So if things come up and they feel overwhelming, or you start to feel a little spacey or weird, like maybe you're numbing out, it's okay to stop the video, regroup, ground, and then come back to the video series. Never push yourself to go through this too quickly because it does bring up a lot. And there's a reason that you've kind of avoided dealing with all this emotional baggage from the past. You've learned to kind of sequester it away or push it away and put it on the shelf. And we're bringing it off the shelf, but that can bring up a lot. So I just want you to be gentle and careful with yourself. So this is what we'll be covering. In this module, Module 1, we'll talk about what traumatic stress is. And then we'll talk in Module 2 about how trauma affects thinking, feeling, and acting. And in Module 3, we'll be dealing with how to cope with traumatic stress. And finally, in Module 4, I'll explain some of the main ways to handle stress, traumatic stress therapeutically. And you can kind of decide what would work for you based on what you've heard. You'll also learn about resiliency and post-traumatic growth, which is how people get even better as a result of traumatic events happening to them. And it's important to remember our brains are very adaptable to adverse situations, and we can change the way our minds work. So just because something traumatic happened to you does not mean that's the end of your life and you have to keep suffering. So stress happens, I'm going to move myself down here. Stress happens in a number of ways, and not all stress is bad. In fact, it's inevitable, and some stress, called eustress, is helpful to us. So when you go to the gym and you're lifting weights, you are building muscle, but you're putting stress on your bones and your muscles and ligaments and tendons, and that is helping you be healthier. Sometimes we need a little stimulation or things to challenge us. Like if your kid's in school and he's already reading and everyone else is trying to sound words out, he's under challenge. He needs a little more stimulation. But with that stimulation comes stress. So that's manageable stress. But distress comes when the stress isn't manageable. So it's more challenging and it causes anxiety, sorrow, or pain. So some of the responses that human beings and other animals have to acute stress are fight, flight, you probably heard of those, freeze, and fawn. So fighting is fine if there's an actual threat to your safety or the safety of your loved one. Like if someone is trying to take your kid away from you, or if someone has a knife and they're coming after you, you have to decide, do I run away or can I disarm this person? And that's when stress is your friend. But if you treat everyone and everything like a potential threat, you risk getting in fights unnecessarily and alienating people because you're just so aggressive and hard to be around. And it's okay to avoid risk and danger if it's truly a danger and not just something that makes you uncomfortable. So it's an avoidant response to flee, and it can look like chronic anxiety, feeling edgy, ready to run away from potential danger. But when everything seems dangerous, even when it isn't, you run the risk of making your life very small. And pretty soon there's all these things that you associate with danger that you're avoiding, and you don't get to do anything. And it's pretty boring and isolating. Freeze is what happens when an animal just kind of, or a human, recognizes, I can't get out of this. I'm just going to play dead or play possum, as they used to say. So you shut down because you feel trapped or paralyzed by the stress of the situation. And this sometimes happens when you're being physically attacked or raped or sexually assaulted. If you feel like there's nowhere to go, you might just kind of vacate yourself emotionally. And we'll go over that a little bit more later in module 2. You may not have words to describe what you're going through at those times because the language part of the brain is offline. It's not engaged. Only the primitive part of the brain and the emotional part are engaged because they're trying to keep you alive. And the fawn response, some people don't really understand this, but again, if you feel trapped and it seems like there's no way to fight or get away, you might try to please the aggressor or whoever is hurting you. And you may try to avoid conflict and further harm. And sometimes this gets kind of, if you have to do it over time repeatedly, it becomes a pattern and you become kind of a people pleaser and you forget about your own needs and wants in a situation. So basically what used to be, with traumatic stress, what used to be an adaptive response to real danger, it stays on as your go-to response. And you forget that you have other options because you learn that this is your way of surviving. So unfortunately, that can block you from joy, love, spontaneity, living in the moment, all the things that we do when we're not stressed. So you may wonder, well, what is trauma anyway? There's so bad stuff happens to us all the time, right? We're constantly in a state of conflict and all kinds of stressful situations go on in our lives. But the things that really stick with us for a long time and the things that disturb us and we can't let go of, you can think of those as the more traumatic events. And there's two main elements of psychological trauma: the emotional response to the overwhelming event and a sense of helplessness. So you can be injured both physically with a bodily injury, or you can be emotionally or psychologically traumatized. So after you're exposed to a disturbing event, whether it's one time or over a series of times, you experience negative physical, emotional, and cognitive symptoms in an attempt to adapt to the event. So you're still trying to survive and you're trying to figure out a way. And in that moment, it makes sense to either run or fight or fawn or freeze. But unfortunately, you get kind of locked in that response. So over a long period of time, you may start to see that as your only option, and you may habitually fight or fly or flee or get in fights or um, do other things to kind of numb yourself out emotionally. So there's the acute response that happens during and immediately after the event, the chronic response, and then a complex response. So let's say you're a kid and you're living in a dysfunctional home. So your parents are drinking all the time and they're getting in fights, and someone at school is picking on you, and no one seems to care. Your siblings don't protect you, your parents don't seem to care, and you're not doing well in school and you get ridiculed in class, those all compound to create more and more trauma for you. So again, traumatic stress is your emotional response to the terrible event. And usually the response is shock, denial, and eventually your emotions get dysregulated, which is a fancy way of saying you get upset easily and you feel out of control. On the other side, you might have times where you can't feel anything about it and you feel emotionally numb. And so if a traumatic event overwhelms your usual coping ability, it means that you have a hard time responding to life in the present because you're still preoccupied with the past. And trauma, it gets stored in the brain differently from regular memories. Usually it's like, okay, I went to school, I had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch, I learned about history, and I came home. That's a regular memory. A traumatic memory gets stored in bits and pieces. So you might have, let's say, a dog bit you, you might have a piece of memory like hearing the dog bark in one spot, and then you may have a memory of being trapped in another spot. And none of these pieces are coherent and linear. So it's hard sometimes to remember what happened in a linear, sequential way. And that spottiness of the memory also can make it hard if you're in a court case to report accurately what happened, because you may not remember the really overwhelming parts. So this often happens, traumatic stress, in situations that threaten your life or integrity, like being physically attacked or sexually assaulted. But it can happen, they have what are called small t traumas. So neglect, um, even though you're not being hit on a regular basis in your family of origin, you're not, you might have times where your parents forget to pick you up from school, or you might have times when you went to school and you didn't have good hygiene because no one taught you how to bathe. Or you may not have any help with your homework, so you might fall behind scholastically. And even though these aren't like sharp, acute events, they add up to feeling traumatized on a regular basis. You may feel trapped, helpless, and experience speechless terror. And that's more in the big T traumas like rape and physical assault and combat. your nervous system is overwhelmed, and the imprint of the traumatizing event lives on inside of you as though it just happened, and it won't let go. And that's the hard part. Other people are like, oh, that happened in the past. What are you still going on about it? It doesn't feel like that. It feels like it just happened. And no one seems to understand that. And it's hard. So, not everything, however, that happens to you that upsets you is traumatizing. For example, sometimes you just, maybe you had to pay taxes or you got audited by the IRS and it was hard and you were frustrated and angry, but it wasn't traumatizing. Unfortunately, it's good that we now know about trauma and we've expanded it to more situations than just, death or combat. But it's still, I think sometimes it gets overused. So if something bugs you and you bounce back within a few days, chances are it wasn't traumatizing, it was just upsetting. And yet, sometimes we think, we're so used to a traumatizing situation that we think it's normal. And so sometimes it's tricky. It's hard to tell which is which. So you might ask yourself, okay, so if upsetting events aren't traumatic all the time, then what is traumatizing? It, to some degree, is somewhat subjective, but there are many different things that can lead to psychological trauma. And there are different types. So some are sudden and unexpected, like single acts of violence, or car accidents, or natural disasters. And others kind of wear away at your sense of safety and integrity, like ongoing interpersonal violence or child maltreatment. So here's just a partial list, and there's much more, believe me. Um, so if you're involved in combat in the military or violence in your community, like you hear gunshots in your neighborhood or you witness a death, um, witnessing or participating in physical aggression against other people. So maybe you're in a gang and you've been involved in killing people or beating them up, or you've watched other people do that. Physical assault, people jumping you or hitting you, sexual assault or rape, childhood neglect, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, being bullied at school or at the workplace as well. And intimate partner violence, which that used to be domestic violence. Now it's intimate partner violence. That's a new phrase for it. Neglect of children or elderly or dependent adults, which, if you think about it, they're in a helpless state and they're depending on you or some adult for help. And if you deny that to them, they may not know that they can survive. Living with family members who are mentally ill or substance abusing, and sudden separation from loved ones. It can be from death, from incarceration, from deportation of your family member, or from murder or suicide. So these are all things that can lead to traumatic stress. But there's a bigger picture as well. There's intergenerational trauma. So let's say your caregivers were raised with violence, abuse, or neglect, and they don't know how to do better for you, their child. And so they come to think of the patterns that they saw growing up as normal. They think they're okay. It's okay to hit your kid or make them break off a switch to punish them. And so if those parents grow up and don't address their own trauma and their own wounding, they may raise their children similarly and inflict further harm. I've also seen parents go the opposite direction and indulge their kids and not set any limits with them, which isn't helpful for the children either. So somewhere in between is good. You know, you don't want to punish children physically and make them feel powerless and helpless, but you want natural consequences for negative actions. So if you think on a global level, if you get enough kids who are raised poorly by parents who don't address their own wounding, and then they have their own wounds and they raise their children and so on to be abused. And then these kids and these adults go out in the bigger world and interact with each other, the harm spreads to wider to communities and states and countries, the whole world. And we have the mess we have today. So we think about trauma in our communities and at a global level. Poverty, we have some horrible poverty in the world, both in our country, the United States, and also in other countries, of course. Extreme bullying and violence in school, as I mentioned, various forms of oppression and discrimination that get institutionalized and become the way we just do business in the world, the way we govern, the way we make policy. Community violence, war, terrorism. Just imagine going to school and wondering if there's going to be a suicide bomber who blows up your school, or if some crazy guy is going to come into your school and shoot it up. It's very hard to feel at ease when that's happening. Involvement in cults and extreme religious groups. So you may not agree with this politically, but there is a traumatizing effect as well from sexism, racism, cultural erasure, homophobia, transphobia, class oppression, ableism, the list goes on. Because those people who are different are made to feel like they don't belong, like they can't connect with anyone. And one of the biggest problems with trauma and traumatic stress is that you feel like you're all alone dealing with whatever happened to you. You feel isolated. So if as a whole group of people, you feel like no one cares about what happened to you, that's pretty awful, and it makes it harder to heal. So you may wonder, does traumatic stress always lead to mental health problems or PTSD? And the answer is not always, but not everyone who goes through post-traumatic stress develops PTSD, and it impacts people differently. And some of the things that can happen are you can develop depression or other mood disorders, anxiety disorders like panic disorder, separation anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. You can develop substance use disorders, and we'll talk about that more later. And you can also learn to habitually dissociate. And dissociation is basically you are separated from your reality. So let's say you're being sexually assaulted and you don't want that to happen and you're trapped. You may feel like, I can't be here. And it's not even a conscious choice. Your mind just goes somewhere else to preserve your sanity. But after a while, if enough terrible things happen to you and you have nowhere to go and you're trapped, you may habitually learn to separate from yourself mentally and emotionally. And after a while, it's hard to come back into your body and be comfortable there because you think, well, what's next? How am I going to survive this? Also, somatic body-based disorders also develop. So sometimes people develop gastrointestinal problems like inflammatory bowel disease or IBS or Crohn's disease. And so, like I said, some people actually develop post-traumatic growth and some people are more resilient than others, but it's not uncommon to develop post-traumatic stress symptoms and these other mental health conditions. So you may wonder, what are common symptoms after a traumatic event? Now, just because you have these doesn't necessarily mean that you'll develop PTSD in the future, but usually you want to be left alone. You want to avoid anything that reminds you of the trauma. You may feel shaky and trembly. You may feel emotionally numb. You may have intrusive, repetitive re-experiencing like nightmares or images or flashbacks. And you may also be preoccupied with the traumatic event. You may have a heightened startle reaction. But after a while, if that's going on for more than a month, then it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. So you may wonder how common PTSD is and what it looks like. So an estimated 4 to 10% of American adults have some form of PTSD. In environments with higher conflict, the rate is higher. And there are certain ethnic groups or parts of the population that are at higher risk. One is adolescents, Latino and Latina people, African American people, and Indigenous Americans. Also, it can be very traumatizing, especially in today's environment that's very anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ, that can predispose someone to developing PTSD as well. People with PTSD, as I said before, have reliving symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares. Their nervous systems are working overtime. So it looks like hypervigilance. They're always on alert to see if someone's going to hurt them again. They may be overly reactive to sounds and other senses. You've probably known someone with PTSD who can't have their back to the public. So they have to, if they're in a restaurant, they need to have their back to the wall so they don't get ambushed from behind. They may have exaggerated startle responses. So if you just tap them on the arm, they might jump like that. They may also have trouble with sleep and relaxing, and avoid things that remind them of the trauma. At the same time, they may feel at times emotionally numb and then at other times emotionally overreactive. And it also affects memory and concentration, and it may be hard to remember certain aspects of the trauma. I've met a lot of people who have a hard time remembering almost anything about their childhood. And it's not just because it happened a long time ago, they really can't access it. Luckily, with therapy, you generally kind of get some of that back. And it also affects what you think about yourself and the world. So, and as I mentioned, some people develop dissociative disorders like derealization, depersonalization, dissociative identity disorder, etc. So if you consult the DSM-5-TR, which is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the latest edition, these are some of the symptoms that accompany PTSD. So as I mentioned, the intrusive memories and thoughts, the avoidance and numbing, which can lead to interpersonal isolation. You may not even enjoy spending time with your own family or with your romantic partners or friends. You may have a decrease in interest in previously enjoyed activities. So you may not really even want to do your old hobbies. You may think about yourself negatively, like I'm bad or you can't trust anyone. And you may have distorted blame or guilt about the event. You may think that somehow you brought it on yourself. And your emotions may be very hard to control. Like you might feel fearful all the time, or angry, or guilty, or shameful. And as I mentioned, you're detached, and sometimes you're emotionally numb. You just can't give a care. But other times you might be really irritable for no reason, apparently. You may be angry, you may have rage outbursts, and you may have a hard time trusting other people. You may feel like you have to be on the lookout, and that takes so much of your brain space that you have difficulty concentrating or staying focused. So for kids, that looks like they might space out during class, or they might not listen when they're in school. For adults, it means that if you have a mentally demanding job, you just can't seem to get your head around it anymore. And of course, you also have trouble with sleep. So you may wonder, what happens in my body when I'm faced with a traumatic event? So as I mentioned, your memory is fragmented and bits of sensory information get stored in various parts of the brain. The speech part of your brain shuts down, and your attention narrows just to the threat that you're experiencing. You go into survival mode, which means that you're only using primitive parts of the brain, your emotional parts, and just the parts that are needed for survival. Your stress hormones are released into your bloodstream, and so that you can fight or flee. And your blood rushes to your muscles. Your liver dumps sugar into your system so you can fight or flee. Now, in someone with chronic PTSD, meaning they've had it for years, the hormones that accompany stress take longer to return to normal levels than people who don't have PTSD. And so the trauma lives on longer in our body than we realize. It also affects how you think and feel about yourself. So you might personalize what happened to you. You may think somehow you brought it on or it was your fault. This is especially true in children. They tend to think, oh, that happened because I was a bad boy or girl or person, because they're naturally egocentric. But also, teens and adults can personalize traumatic events too. And sometimes that's an attempt to feel like you're in control when you're actually not in control. You can also feel shame, which is a painful feeling of humiliation from the idea that you acted incorrectly or that you're deeply flawed as a human. And so it's similar to embarrassment and guilt, but it's more extreme. So guilt can actually help us prevent us from doing bad things, but it's inappropriate when we think that everything we do is bad or that we're responsible, say, for other people's feelings. Shame is more about self-criticism, self-hatred. So there's healthy shame and toxic shame. Healthy shame helps us realize that we're not perfect, but toxic shame makes us feel like we're bad just for existing. And you may feel more defensive than necessary if you have toxic shame. When people are even giving you helpful, constructive criticism, um, because it all feels threatening based on what happened to you before. So people who were raised in very, very critical environments where the other members of your family make you feel like you can never do anything right. I see that a lot in children of alcoholics and addicts or narcissists, but it can even happen in families where just regular stuff is going on. But shame is a big issue for a lot of trauma survivors. It can also give you unrealistic expectations of yourself or of other people. So, for example, a lot of people think that they should have been able to defend themselves or do something adult-like, even if they were abused as children. Like they think that somehow at age 10 or 5, they were supposed to know how to handle a traumatic situation. And part of therapy is helping them go, wait a minute, I was only 5 or I was only 10. How was I supposed to know to call the police or do whatever we think we were supposed to do? We may also think of ourselves as broken or damaged. But I want you to realize that no matter what happened to you, you're not permanently damaged. You survived it, and the worst is over. And that traumatic event does not define you. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be suffering. And there's more to you than your traumatic past. So there are different ways that you protect yourself when you've been traumatized. For example, you may actually do pretty well in a crisis, but little everyday stressors can really make you come undone. You may be kind of spaced out or distant from other people. That's sort of like a way of protecting yourself. But even when you're around family or loved ones that you actually want to spend time with, you just can't seem to engage. You may seem distant to other people, and they might think of you as aloof or reserved. You might feel disconnected from your body. And I've seen that with people where they get into accidents or they do things to hurt themselves, not intentionally, but just because they're checked out from their body. You may avoid contact with crowds or busy, loud environments. So being at a fair or being at a big store like Walmart might be overwhelming for you because you have a heightened sense of all your senses, basically your sight and smell and touch and hearing. It's so acute from the trauma, and you just all the sounds get to you after a while. You may socialize less or not at all. even with people you care about. And in the moment, they may feel like these things are helpful, but eventually they isolate you and hinder your healing. So there are different ways to cope with traumatic stress, and we'll be talking about that more in future models. I just want to distinguish. So you may find yourself in some of these examples, and I do not mean any of this to be a criticism or a judgment on how you're coping. I just want to give you healthy options and to help you distinguish what are healthy ways to cope versus unhealthy. And it's very tempting when you've been traumatized to numb your overwhelming feelings or to feel something if you're feeling too numb. So drugs and alcohol are a popular choice with people who go through traumatic events. Sometimes people do things compulsively, like have sex with a lot of different people or have sex with the same person more than usual. And it feels like they have to keep doing it to avoid what they're feeling. Or again, to feel something. They might overspend and go binge shopping, binge eating, exercising excessively to blot out what they're feeling. Some people become workaholics. Anything to avoid that just weird, either feeling too much or feeling too little. Um, Other people may turn to self-harm as a way to cope. And obviously, that leaves scars when you burn yourself or cut yourself excessively. When you hit yourself, you give yourself bruises. And I've worked with a lot of teenagers who do self-injury, and then later they really regret it because their skin doesn't look that nice, and it's kind of embarrassing when they are in a hot weather situation where they don't have long sleeves to cover up the scars. Sometimes medication can be helpful for things like depression or anxiety, but they don't permanently change the way you think or feel about the traumatic event. I know that now psychedelic assisted therapy is a big thing, and I don't know yet whether that's going to really permanently change and cure people of PTSD. But the usual psychiatric medications don't seem to really address it. Once people go off it, unless they've done the work on themselves, they tend to relapse into whatever they were dealing with, depression or anxiety. And it doesn't reconnect you to other people or to healthier parts of your mind or reconsolidate your memory. And we'll be talking more about memory reconsolidation later. So sometimes medication can even mask a real problem, which is, experiencing the traumatic event in the first place. Sometimes the emotions that we have that are really strong and disturbing are telling us get out of a bad situation. If you're being battered as a spouse or you're being emotionally abused by your parents or your loved ones, maybe it's good that you're feeling bad about it, as long as you have the energy and the wherewithal to get out of the situation. So it's important, no matter what kind of treatment you pursue, to be an active participant. Don't just be someone's patient or client. And we'll talk more about that in modules 3 and 4. So trauma can also affect you spiritually, even if you're not religious. So whether or not you believe in a higher power or something bigger than yourself, trauma can affect how you feel about your existence and your purpose on earth and being part of a larger whole. And you may wonder, is God or the higher power you believe in, a benevolent being? Or are they punishing me because I went through this trauma or I lost someone I loved? Did God let me down? Is the world a dangerous place? Is it safe to connect to others? Am I doomed to be alone or lonely in the world? And you may wonder, like, maybe I should talk to, if I have a priest or a rabbi or a spiritual leader that I trust and whose opinion I respect, maybe I should talk to them about what I'm going through, because maybe you can get some spiritual healing that way. And you may wonder, who's minding the universe? Like, how could God let me down this way? How could God let this happen? Especially if it was abuse of a child. Like, what were you thinking, God, right? What is the purpose for bad things like this happening to us? And even some religious leaders don't really know how to answer that question, honestly. Um, some of it's beyond our comprehension, and you may or may not be even satisfied with what science says about why bad things happen. So I just want to caution you that even if your religion may seem to let you down when you're in the throes of trauma, or your spiritual beliefs, it doesn't mean that they're all deeply flawed, unless, you're part of a really bizarre cult or something. If you throw out the parts of your relationship with the higher spirit or whatever that you don't like or that make you uncomfortable, you might miss out on the greater whole. And so it's important to kind of see like this questioning and this discomfort as part of the healing process. It's good that you're questioning, but you're not going to feel this bad forever. You will come to some kind of resolution eventually. And each person has their own relationship with human existence and their beliefs about whether a higher power exists. And you may kind of wonder, like, how do I heal spiritually? You may want to re-examine your relationship to the cosmos and see what's working for you and what isn't. So it's important to also just mention, and we'll talk about this later, attachment as a way of coping with traumatic stress. It really has an impact on how we deal with stress. If you're lucky, you were born to parents or caregivers who are kind and predictable and consistent and caring, and who respect you and respect your boundaries. And they respond to your needs adequately, and they enjoy being your parent or caregiver. So that creates secure attachment. There's a guy named John Bowlby who is a British psychiatrist, and he really studied a lot about attachment. And he came up with 4 different types. There's secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, which in adulthood is called fearful/avoidant. And so the last 3 types of attachment are insecure attachment, which have implications for being able to trust other people, deal with your emotions, feel close to yourself and to other people, your physical and emotional well-being, and therapeutic outcomes. So attachment is obviously best fostered in a nice, healing, happy, safe environment where your parents are present mentally and physically, and you have enough to eat, and you have enough to drink, and you have food and shelter and clothing and predictability. Also, as we discussed before, a little bit of stimulation. Unfortunately, Many people don't have that. And so your attachment to your caregiver can really influence your handling of stress and whether you feel safe in the world. And the way you learn about the world is how you're treated as a baby and a child and adolescent. So way back when, there was a study based on some people who were trying to figure out why um, people in a weight loss clinic kept regaining weight. And they studied how adverse childhood experiences influence coping with stress. Also caregiver bonding and physical and mental health. And we'll talk more about that in the next module. But A stands for adverse childhood experience. And here are some of the many adverse childhood events. Physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, neglect as a child. If your caregiver or family members were mentally ill or abused substances or were in jail or prison or separated from you through divorce or even deportation. If you witnessed intimate partner violence between your caregivers, if you were discriminated against based on race or ethnicity, gender identity, religion, sexual orientation, differently abled, or differences in the way you learn. Poverty, community violence, bereavement and loss, and systemic institutionalized oppression. So these probably look familiar from another slide because they all create trauma potentially. So it's no mistake that these all kind of coincide, right? So in summary, we've looked at what trauma is, what traumatic events are, and how they affect you mentally, physically, spiritually, and how it affects your relationship with yourself and others, what adverse childhood experiences and attachment are, and how they impact your handling of stress. So at this point, there might be a lot going on for you internally. You might have memories pop up. You may have emotions about what happened to you when you were younger. Anything is possible, right? So at this point, I encourage you to write in your journal or in the workbook. The workbook has some prompts about like different ideas to write about. And I want you to just take some time to reflect on how this material has affected you so far. And it's important to do this because if you don't kind of take a little time to process at this point, then all this stuff is just kind of roaming around inside of you with nowhere to go. But putting it down on the page or talking to a friend about it or talking to me about it, all those things can help you kind of summarize for yourself and get it out of your mind and out of your body and emotions. But if you want to go a step further and do the guided meditation with me, and then journal, that's fine too. So keep listening. So if you're sticking with me for now and you didn't pause, or if you paused and came back, please go to a place where you're safe and you won't be disturbed for the next 20 to 30 minutes. You may want to have a journal handy or some water and some tissue, like Kleenex in case you cry. And you want to get comfortable in your seat and sit with a straight back, either in a chair or a cushion on the floor. And this is a useful start to processing your response to learning about traumatic stress. And you can adapt it in all other parts of this program to suit your needs. As I said in the beginning, I want you to take your time and really go at your pace. There will also be a separate audio file that you can click on to hear the meditation if you don't want the visuals. All you need to do is just listen and notice. There are many paths to wellness, and you're finding your own way to experience greater peace and calm. So now that you've found your safe place to be, I'd like you to take some time to check in now, to get quiet and focused on your internal state. Learning about trauma and how it impacts you can bring up many feelings, memories, maybe images or thoughts. And I'm not sure how you're taking all this information in. Some of it may be new to you, but some may be familiar. And some of it may be heard or experienced in a different way today. And as you get comfortable without going to sleep, you can be somewhat alert while sitting in a chair or a couch or on a cushion or the ground. But it can help to have a relaxed, straight posture with your ears, shoulders, and hips lined up. As you find that position that allows you to go within more easily and deeply than before, you can allow one part of your mind, your conscious mind, to keep having its usual thoughts and experiences, while another, deeper part of you, your unconscious mind, can be taking in my words, learning new things about yourself, making new connections between the past and the present, while also learning to observe what's happening within comfortably, curiously, calmly. You may think of taking a walk in a pleasant place, one that gives you comfort and ease. Many people like to picture somewhere in nature where it may just be you and the elements. And as you're walking, taking each step at a time, your breathing becomes deeper on the in-breath and shorter on out-breath. Step by step, easily making your way, looking around at the scenery and what's around you, being the seer and not the scenery. As I count from 10 down to 1, You can allow yourself to become increasingly absorbed in your internal experience, allowing your awareness of the external world to gradually fade into the distance. Since you're in a safe enough space right now, you can safely do that. And on your little walk, you may come to a place where a staircase allows you to go down to a level that you want to go, a deeper level of absorption, concentration. And as you descend the stairs, your awareness within becomes increasingly focused on what's going on inside. 10, feeling your feet as they descend step by step. 9, and with your feet you also feel legs, torso, arms. 8, feeling shoulders, neck, and head looser, softer. With each breath, loosening any tension that may be stored there. 7, wondering how deep you'll go. 6, 5, this is for your benefit, for your learning how to go within safely, comfortably. 3, too still and comfortable to want to move much. One step at a time as you reach your destination. And in your destination, you can notice more details about your experience because you're focused on your internal experience and not the outside. You now can see how you feel emotionally, physically, spiritually, what thoughts you have now. You might continue to walk along in that deeper state, exploring, noticing. On any walk, you observe things around you that you might like. A beautiful sunset, a majestic rock or mountain, shells and pebbles on a beach that you might wish to pick up. Isn't it nice to know that you can choose what to observe, what to ignore and walk past, what to pick up and hold close to you, and what to discard? You get to choose because it's your experience. Just as you see the scenery around, you might also notice sensations, emotions, thoughts, memories that have emerged while watching this video. Some may be pleasant, some may be unpleasant. and some may be neutral. You can just watch them emerge one by one, or they may come in clusters. But you can start to separate them, what you do and don't want to focus on. Because more and more, the deeper you go within, the more control you have, the more choice. You get to decide what to keep, what to discard, what is useful, what is not. Isn't it good to know that you have this choice now? There may be some memories or feelings that on the surface seem disturbing or upsetting. But when you look at them more closely, you start to notice how they want to be seen, to be noticed, because they're part of your history, a history that has some tragedy and some triumph, some sorrow, some joy. But as a wise man once observed, you can't have the joy without the sadness, the light without the dark, the day without the night. So you can learn to observe it all and to allow all of it to be there, accepting and observing. And you don't have to like something to accept it. You just see how it's all part of your experience, your story. And if there are any parts that are too difficult to bear, too hard to just sit back and observe, you can allow those images to be placed in a heavy, thick container that holds it until you're feeling stronger, calmer, better able to observe it. I'm going to be quiet in a minute for 60 seconds. And during that time, you can build your box for the things that are too hard to deal with right now. And when I speak again, you can continue your deep inner work easily and smoothly. And that minute starts now. During that minute, which may have felt longer or shorter than a minute, it was just 60 seconds. You've had a chance to make this container. And now you can put whatever you wish in that container. It will be there, waiting for you to look at later. Perhaps when you feel like you can look at it more objectively. Just put any thoughts, images, body sensations, or memories that you may not be prepared to deal with at this time, or just memories that you'd rather put aside for now. Putting it all in that heavy container and putting the lid on it that only you can lock or unlock, because you alone have the key. And with those elements safely in the box, you can start to feel more in control of what happens inside of you. Now, every time you listen to this recording, and you may want to listen to it daily for a while, you get better and better at putting what's overwhelming or too much for you in that container. So you can go through life a little lighter, a little less burdened by the past. Isn't it nice to know that you're developing this skill and that you can revisit the past when you want, on your terms, not when the memories want to intrude on you? And in a minute or two, I'll ask you to let your unconscious mind put the finishing touches on this experience, knowing that you can come back to learn this skill better and better whenever you hear my voice. Today you've learned that you need to go slow and take your time. And you've learned what you need to learn for right now. And you'll get more and more depth and dimension to your learning as you listen to this repeatedly. But for now, you'll be able to come back into the room and regain conscious control over your mind and body, so you can start to notice your surroundings, feel the energy come back into your muscles, coming back into the present moment, refreshed and alert. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, fully consciously alert and wide awake all over.